Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking briefly at First Chronicles. Now, you have to know that First and Second Chronicles were originally one single book, but we're just going to look at the first part of that, First Chronicles. The title of the books of Chronicles, as I said, this is they're a unified book. Somewhere along the line, they got split into two. The Hebrew title of the book is Divrei Ha-Yomim. A yom is a word for a day, so yomim is days. It just means words of the days. The Greek title, para lepo menon, this is things left to the side. You know, like a paramedic is somebody that works alongside. I know that doesn't really work for paramedic. A paralegal is somebody who works maybe alongside a lawyer. That's the para part. So things left to the side, and in a sense, that lets you know that the Book of Chronicles assumes you've already read First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings, and then these are going to be some extra things, and a lot of people take Chronicles exactly that way. You know, they'll read through First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and they come to Chronicles and they've already read that, so they sort of speed read through it very quickly. And I think it's worthwhile to slow down and take this as an independent work, although in a sense it is in a sense a sequel, but not running after First and Second Kings, but rather running alongside of them. Now, when we look at Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, notice First Chronicles actually is going to go all the way back to Adam. So if we wanted to really be in parallel, we'd start all the way back in Genesis. But it's not giving us the whole storyline. What it's doing is just giving us the names by way of a genealogy, all the way up to Saul and David, and it slows down as we get to the death of Saul. And then Second Chronicles is going to pick up with the reign of Solomon and go all the way to through the divided kingdom. Although it's not really going to talk much about the northern kingdom of Israel, only the southern kingdom of Judah. And then at the end of that period, Judah is alone, and then you have the Babylonian captivity, and then the return from that captivity. And that's all going to be in First and Second Chronicles. Now, as I said, Genesis through First Samuel it tells the whole story from Adam to David, and then remember, First Samuel actually ends with the death of Saul, which is picked up in First Chronicles. So you have the death of Saul right toward the end. Next, you have Second Samuel, and then First and Second Kings. And throughout that period, you have the nation of Israel, which is united for the most part. Yes, when Saul first dies, David for a time is only king of the one tribe of Judah, but after 7 years, he unites all of Israel, and the same thing with Solomon. But then, after the death of Solomon, after the reign of Solomon, and after his death, Israel is divided into the north and the south, and we see that halfway through First Kings and all the way through the end of Second Kings. So we've got Israel and Judah as two separate countries, and that comes to a close with the fall of Samaria in Second Kings chapter 17. And then after Samaria falls and Israel is taken away into captivity, Judah, the southern kingdom, is there by itself alone. And so we see that in both Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Notice that this is the material that's covered by all three of these. Now, when we compare Kings and Chronicles, and we're going to look at a few things there, Kings, First and Second Kings relates the historical facts. It doesn't give a lot of commentary along the way. It's just telling us a story, a bit like when we look in the New Testament at the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke really just tell us the story of Jesus. They do not give us much in the way of commentary. Chronicles, on the other hand, is going to tell us a story, but it's going to give the meaning behind the story. It's going to give the meaning of the facts that were given in Kings. And in the New Testament, the Gospel of John is a lot like that, where in the Gospel of John, it has quite a bit of commentary, both in the way it begins and running throughout and at the end, much more so than the Synoptic Gospels do. Now, Kings, as I said, the storyline in First and Second Kings, once the kingdom has divided after the death of Solomon, it moves back and forth between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, and it's really quite sort of difficult to, you're reading the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom and back and forth, and you almost need to draw it out because it can be quite confusing, especially you get to the middle part and there's some of the kings that have the same names. There's a Joram in the north and then a Jehoram in the south, and you say, well, wait a minute, which one are we talking about? It can be a little bit confusing. It's much easier when we get to Chronicles because in Chronicles the perspective is focused primarily on the temple and what you can see from the temple, and what you can see from the temple is the kings of Judah because that's who live in Jerusalem. So Chronicles is not going to mention much about the kings of the northern kingdom. Uh, they will be very limited in their exposure in First and Second Chronicles. Instead, it's going to be the southern kingdom of Judah, and especially what you can see from inside and looking out the door of the temple. That's the perspective in Chronicles. Now, the recipients of the book are those who have returned from the exile because the book is going to end where Cyrus, the king of the Persians, has followed the Babylonian Empire. He's just conquered the Babylonian Empire. And the first thing he does is he issues a proclamation and he says, all of you Jewish people are now free to go home. And presumably some have gone home and maybe some haven't. Um, but as you read the book, you almost get a sense that you're reading something a little bit like an official chronicle, an official diary. You know how you write a diary? You don't write a diary at the end of your life. You write it as you are experiencing life. And so you might say, this is happening today. And then the next day, this is happening today. You say, well, which day was it? Well, you have to read each day of the diary. And likewise, there are times when chronicles will say, this took place and these people are living there all the way up to today. And you say, well, wait a minute, that they didn't live there all the way up through the Babylonian captivity. But no, through the period of when that section of the diary was written, but then it continues to have entries all throughout. And then I imagine eventually all these entries are gathered together and collated and placed into one continuous book and published in the form that we have. Now, the purpose of the book of Chronicles, first of all, to set forth a record of the priestly worship of God's people from David all the way to the exile. So there's a lot of focus here on worship, on prayers, on what goes on in the temple. Secondly, to give the fulfillment of the promises of the Mosaic Law regarding faithfulness and unfaithfulness to the covenant. So you're going to see times where some of the kings of Judah are going to be faithful and things they're going to go well. They'll have victory in battle and they will enjoy peace and prosperity and all sorts of good things happen. And then there are times when the kings do not do well, when they turn away from God and famine begins to take place and invaders come into the land and all sorts of bad things begin to happen because they are being unfaithful to the covenant. Finally, to show the importance of the scriptures in providing the rule of faith for God's people. And so you're going to have quite a number of references to the law. And of course, Chronicles is part of the scriptures, but it's looking back at what God had already given for his people to read and to understand and to follow, and how they really need to do that. Now, here's our outline just of First Chronicles. Chapters 1 through 9 are going to give genealogies of Israel, mostly just names, focusing especially on the line of David and on the line of Aaron, the priest, but we're going to see all of the tribes mentioned. And then the story part begins in chapter 10 with the death of Saul. He's the first of Israel's two kings, but really it's not giving all of Saul's reign, just his death. And that leads us, beginning in chapter 11, to the reign of King David, where we see his mighty men and how they captured Jerusalem, and some of the other things that they did. And then in chapters 13 through 16, the ark is brought into Jerusalem, and there's worship that's taking place. There's no temple yet. That's not going to be until Second Chronicles, but they're getting ready for it. In chapters 17 through 27, we see the covenant promises, and then in the last two chapters, the site is prepared for where the temple will stand, and it's going to stand on Mount Moriah, but we won't see it built until Second Chronicles.